Darkness kills, destroys the will. Find a spark, make hearts thrill. Hear the tales of time so grim. Shine a light, don't let it dim. Heather Brown downtown, bound. True crime story she's found. In the shadows, secret stay. Need a light that finds the way.
Welcome back to another exciting episode of Defeating the Darkness, true crime stories with Downtown Heather Brown. That's me, your host. I'm a former homicide and sexual assault prosecutor here in Orange County, and I love bringing on fascinating guests onto the show to tell all of our listeners about some area or some passion or work that they do in the world that brings light to people in their darkest places. And tonight, because it's a night shoot, I am super, super excited for our guest, Dr. Cheryl Arutt, who is here. Hello, welcome.
Hello, thank you. I'm so glad to be here.
I am so glad to have you here. And for the listeners, Dr. Arutt is a forensic psychologist, and she isn't just a psychologist. She's an amazing, badass woman who helps people and is on TV and on podcasts and used to be a regular recurring guest on...
I was one of the original Behavior Bureau members on Dr. Drew on HLN. Did that for a few years and a bunch of true crime shows and other types of things, and you know.
So you've probably seen her on TV, but tonight we get the inside scoop, the nitty gritty about being a forensic psychologist, what that even means. So we'll tell the listeners what that means. Okay. And then we'll just have a fabulous conversation about all the cool things that you're doing in your career. And I generally start my episode explaining how I know my guests. So you and I did not meet in a bar.
Nope, we didn't.
We did not meet in a bar, which is sometimes that happens with my guests, but we did meet through our mutual friend, Robin Sachs. So thanks, Robin.
Yes.
Thanks for the intro. I know you're jealous listening right now that I'm here with Cheryl. And so we met at a party that Robin had at her house. And
I think it may have been one of her parties. It may have been that women's event at what I guess is now, it used to be the Beverly Hills Tennis Club. Were you at that?
Yeah, I was at that one.
You were at that one where with Lisa Bloom and all of, that may have been the first time I met you, actually. I think might have been that event. But
I think so.
Yeah, but there have been multiple social events.
So over the years, we just, every time Robin has some fabulous event, we are both there and we chat, and I've just always found you to be delightful and not just fun to talk to, but super intelligent and experienced in what you do. So tell our listeners, what is a forensic psychologist?
A forensic psychologist, and I'm also a clinical psychologist, but the forensic part, very often people think has to do with death because they think about forensic pathologist, but it has to do with anything to do with psychology and the legal system. Like the word comes from the Roman forum, and that's how they got forensic. Okay. And so things like when, they need an expert witness for a psychological issue to help the court understand something about either whether a criminal did something, why they did it, or the impact on a victim who was victimized by a crime, doing psychological evaluations, being able to kind of help the court think about psychological types of issues to make decisions.
Okay, wow. Yeah. And do you, then after you do the evaluation, I'm assuming that you prepare a report that gets submitted to the court?
Both sides as evidence generally, and testify at times, and, depositions, things like that. And,
okay.
And, to be able to really look at, for civil types of cases, like for sexual assault survivors, it's, this is what happened, this is how this impacted this person, this was their functioning prior, this is what it would take to really make them well. I mean, we have some really exciting trauma therapies now that are evidence-based that can really help people get into a very different state of mind. So I like to be able to include that also about, being able to help somebody not just get their day in court and be able to get justice, but also like, what's the path now that you've been through all that? How do you get better?
Okay, wow. There's a lot to break down there with what you just said. So I'm guessing because you said depositions as well, and for our listeners, they don't have depositions, praise the Lord, in criminal cases, because those can be lengthy sometimes and expensive for, the parties and whatnot.
Yeah.
You just, in criminal, when you have a witness, you just call the witness to the stand and it's live. You don't practice or, get to ask them questions in advance. Sometimes you get statements that they've given to the police, but in civil cases, they actually depose the witnesses, and that's done where, there's a court reporter and the attorneys get to ask questions.
And they write down everything you say, and that way they get to know what to expect. They get to try to trip you up to be inconsistent or, make sure you're saying things that are accurate.
And then you also have to go and testify in court if the case actually goes to trial.
It can be stressful.
Yeah, that can be super stressful.
Yeah.
Well, good. Maybe a good psychologist can help you with that stress. No.
Maybe.
So you do the evaluations, prepare reports, and then you actually go to testify. And I'm assuming you do that in criminal and civil cases.
These days, I'm doing much more civil work. But when I was first training and first starting out, I was mentored by an incredible clinical and forensic psychologist. And we did a lot of alternative sentencing evaluations. So those were criminal cases where the person who committed the crime was really obvious to their attorney even that there was something special about the case. This is somebody, who was really had a major mental illness, had some sort of reason that they thought that, maybe this is somebody who's really more sick than bad. And so we would go into prisons with people who'd already been arrested. They were waiting for sentencing. And we would do these alternative sentencing evaluations. And they were some of the most heartbreaking and moving situations, because it's like you arrive at the scene of the train wreck and sit down with somebody and reconstitute, okay, how did this person get here? And then we'd interview their family members and look at all their medical records and other records and then make a report for the court. For a lot of these people, they would have been eaten for breakfast in the prison population, and they really, they fell through the cracks and did something because they needed help. So what felt good about that is we were able to, write something that allowed the judge very often to understand them and to kind of sentence them to treatment instead of punishment.
Yeah. And, I know, having been a prosecutor, sometimes there's very hard lines that people will draw in the sand about that's getting the guy off or,
Sure.
having to pay the penalty for the crime that they committed. But I got to tell you, I never had that, hard line in the sand with any of the cases that I dealt with. But when I first got into private practice, I had this, a friend, tell me about his son who had been arrested for arson. And he was having a tremendous hard time because he said, my son's a good kid. He's not a criminal. He just has a mental illness and he wasn't taking his medication.
Yes.
And the problem was they wanted to put him, the DA was willing to put him in some type of home or a treatment facility to try to help manage his medication so he could, get stabilized.
Right.
And then, potentially be released on his own or back home with the family. But they wouldn't take him because of the charge of the arson.
Oh,
because everybody's like, no, we don't want the arsonist in our facility because they, obviously they have risk concerns about the other patients and everything.
So that's where an evaluation would also address risk of is this a person who's at risk of reoffending and
do you know that he wasn't an arsonist. He was hearing voices and he had lit a fire inside a coffee can because he was wanting it to like scare away the evil spirits that were talking to him. Like it was that simple. And
That is so
he didn't even,
heartbreaking.
and he had been in custody for longer than you can even get penalized for arson. I was sickened by this.
Wow.
And so fortunately, I was able to talk some sense into, the DA and got them to change the charge so he could go into a particular home. So there's so many situations where, it is a mental health issue or really a crisis situation.
Totally.
And if you can help someone to really not just protect them, but protect other people and
Absolutely. And people do things when they're having hallucinations that they would never do normally. And that's a symptom. And sometimes that can be really horrifyingly scary. I mean, I think about like Andrea Yates in that case where this woman drowned her children because she believed that she was saving them from some worse kind of fate. She had this psychotic postpartum depression. And that case was so tragic because, and I didn't work on this case personally, but when they would give her the medication to stop the hallucinations where she would become like sane enough to really understand what she had done, she was so suicidally depressed and in anguish about having done this, that was a whole bunch of other mental health issues that would happen, that she'd go into crisis on that side. And so, I mean, those kinds of cases are just heartbreaking. We want to catch it before it gets at that level where there's, it's hard to see a good way out.
Yeah, 100%. Well, let's just talk about that case for a second. I know you didn't work on it personally, but like, what do you think the remedy is there? I mean, like, how do you? Because you can't, you can't fix that.
No.
Right?
No.
Like, because how do you know she's not going to have another hallucination? It's not like, oh, you just get medicated and you're okay. Like, she murdered
her four
children.
And there was more to that story. She was someone who had psychotic postpartum depression every time she got pregnant. She didn't want to keep getting pregnant. Her husband kept insisting on having more children and getting her pregnant. And as soon as when all of this stuff happened, he just kind of went and married the next one and started having more babies. And it was kind of like her function was to kind of make the babies. Mm-hmm. And in that family, like I could see in a healthier kind of family environment, a husband being like, we need to get you medical help, or if every time you get pregnant, this happens, we need to stop overwhelming you and stop putting you in this position. This was a specifically postpartum psychosis that she had. Wow. And, so there are a lot of things have to go very, very wrong to end up with an outcome like that.
So what ended up happening to her?
I think she's still in prison. I could be wrong, but my understanding is she's still in prison. And I know that someone wrote a play. I don't know the title of it, but about this story. There was someone who in Australia who told me about this play. And
that's a dark play.
Very dark
like, honey, let's go see this play.
I know, right?
She murdered her 4 children. That's
right. But there are these less horrific, but one of the cases we did work on, there was this really lovely old man who walked with a cane, who he had his teeth knocked out with his own cane. His girlfriend, who you could draw the conclusions you will about what that relationship looked like, but he was, she would do things like send him out for groceries and then move. And he was this man who had been a singer and a musician from another country. It's a very gentle soul kind of guy. And he would go into these, he would have these psychotic episodes, not violent episodes, but he became so broken about like, where's my girlfriend? And that he became convinced that the answer was to get on the Geraldo Rivera show, to do something. And then she would see him on Geraldo. And then she would know how to find him and he would get her back. So he decided he had to rob a bank. So he waited in line and he wrote a demand note on the back of his gas bill with his name and address and everything on it. And he went up to the teller, and the teller's name was Ms. Rivera. This was a sign. That's called ideas of reference, when you see connections with things that are not actually connected.
Oh, wow.
And so he gave her, and poor Miss Rivera was probably completely panicked getting, give me the money kind of note. She presses the button and gives him money, and he walked over to the couch in the bank, and he took out this newspaper with a picture of the Pope on it, and he sat there with the bag, and he waited for the police to come so he could get on Geraldo and find his girlfriend. And he couldn't understand why they thought he was actually robbing the bank, because he said at Walmart, you can walk all around the store and it's not stealing till you try to leave. I mean,
But does Geraldo have like a bunch of bank robbers on his show?
No, I mean,
just that initial premise is out there, right?
It's out there. I mean, it was, he was having a mental health crisis because his support system, the person he depended on, abandoned him. He didn't have the medications that he needed. And had he gotten deported for a felony for this, he would have been sent to a country that had very inhumane treatment of people with the kinds of mental health issues that he had. He'd been nonviolent his whole life. He'd been this gentle guy, but his support system collapsed. And so we wrote this report after really evaluating him and understanding what was going on. And this was a case where the judge was able to do 11 downward departures from the sentencing guidelines, where it was a misdemeanor and not a felony. And he was able to get sentenced to treatment and get some support and get medication. And he was never going to do that again. I mean, that was, he didn't even think he was actually robbing the bank.
Wow. Okay. Well, so that was amazing that they had you to evaluate him, and
that one felt good. We felt like we really made a difference in his life.
Okay. So you do these forensic psychological interviews for court and such. And I do want to come back and circle back to, I don't want to say my favorite topic because that sounds terrible, but I work in litigating cases for sexual assault survivors. Yeah. That's my passion.
I'm passionate about that too.
So we're going to have a whole conversation about that. But before we move on to your forensic psychology reports and helping come along survivors in sexual abuse cases, you also said that you're a clinical psychologist. And so you do those reports and you evaluate people and kind of, go testify in those cases. But tell the listeners what a clinical psychologist is, as opposed to a forensic psychologist.
And I'm licensed as a clinical psychologist, which means that I am able to treat patients in various settings, mental health types of issues. I could, if somebody needed to go to the hospital, that is something that clinical psychologists practice independently. And so that may be getting in too much into the weeds of the details of different types of therapists. But it basically means that I do treatment, that I like to use what we know to be able to help people's lives get better and to be able to relieve the distress that they're in and to make their symptoms go away so that they can get better. I love this quote by Esther Perel, who is, she's a Holocaust survivor's child. She is a therapist who has studied eroticism and pleasure and like all this stuff. And her husband is a PTSD expert. It's very interesting. She says, I do pleasure, he does pain, basically. But she says, in her experience growing up in these communities, she says there are two kinds of people who survive trauma. And they're the ones who don't die, and they're the ones who come back to life. And so the clinical psychologist in me is wanting to help people not just survive the trauma, but be able to really feel alive again and be able to come back to life. And I really like that way of thinking.
Yeah, I love that. That's really powerful. And I think that is particularly meaningful and important when you talk about sexual assault survivors.
People get so shut down, right?
Yeah, they get stuck in the trauma and the thoughts in their head. You know, I always say that, like, the real, scene of the crime is in your mind.
That is so true, because it is not just the traumatic event. It is what your brain learns during the traumatic event. Like, if this is happening, what does this say about me? And this tells people how they get to show up in the world, what they can expect from other people, whether they are damaged or defective or shameful or unworthy. Like, your brain decides in that moment, it learns something, and it can be like, I'm not safe. And it can that learning and that part of it ends up then becoming like a filter for many people that influences how they do everything else after that. And people think a lot of times that trauma therapy is about really digging into the traumatic event. It's not. We need to do a better job branding this for people, I think, because it's not even so much about the initial trauma. That's part of it, but there are very safe ways to be able to not kind of go headlong into that, but just like touch that gently with support around. But what we're really looking at is rewiring what your brain and your nervous system learned about not being safe, about not deserving things, about not being able to play and be alive and be free. And that's why I think we're at such an exciting point in terms of the trauma therapies, especially the somatic ones, the evidence-based somatic ones like EMDR therapy.
Yeah, tell us about these. Do you mind talking about them?
Oh my gosh, I love talking about them.
Okay, good. Because that's what I really want to talk about, because I know so many people, just having done the work that I did and the work that I now do, who, you can tell someone all you want, like,
it's not your fault.
It's not your fault. You didn't do anything to deserve this, but it's not what you're telling them. It's what their brain is repeating over and over. And
totally. And if they've gone through any kind of court process, that also gets reinforced. I don't know about you, because you've seen both criminal and civil proceedings. Criminal can be tough, when you're looking at people's, freedom and life and everything. But I'm sorry, civil is a bloodbath.
There's nothing civil about civil.
Oh my God. When it's about money. Like, people would be like, they'd stipulate to this and that, and be very cooperative, even in like capital cases and criminal cases. And the civil stuff is so much more intense. And then you have someone who has been a victim who may understand that there is somebody's job to try to minimize, deny, and blame you for what happened to you. But it's like what we know from the eyebrows up, like intellectually, they may understand this wasn't my fault, and I know I'm telling the truth, and all of these things. But it's like your body didn't get the update.
Your body
the nervous system, what your gut says and what you know to be probably actually true here, don't line up. And what I get excited about with things like EMDR therapy.
What's EMDR therapy?
It is another branding nightmare, actually, in that the psychologist who first discovered it said if she had to do it over, she would have called it reprocessing therapy. But it stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing therapy, EMDR.
Okay.
And she kind of discovered it by accident. She was thinking about something upsetting that happened to her, and she found herself moving her eyes in this very ballistic back and forth way that we don't normally do. I don't know why she was doing this. And she noticed that she felt differently afterward about the upsetting thing. And she was a researcher and in a psychology program. So she started bringing all these people in and asking them to think about things that disturbed them, and guided to move their eyes rapidly. And that was sort of the beginning of understanding. I know it sounds really kind of out there, right? But there are multiple theories about exactly what the mechanism is that makes this work, but one of them is that during REM sleep, rapid eye movement, and when we're dreaming, is a part where our brain does memory consolidation. And we kind of, like when you have a really big decision to make, like what do people say to you? Sleep on it, right?
Right.
Right.
But then you can't sleep because you got this big decision.
Well, that's a good point too. And this doesn't work if you're not actually, doing the rapid eye movement. But what happens is the idea is that information, like if you think about something that didn't bother you, that happened in the past, it feels in the past. If you think about something that still haunts you to this day and you really let yourself think about it, it doesn't feel over. It doesn't feel like the past. It kind of floods you. And the idea is that upsetting information, when it's too disturbing for our brains to do the natural digestion of kind of extracting what's important and letting the rest go and putting it in long-term memory, it gets stuck like a landmine in your brain. And it's got all that raw information in it, the pictures, feelings, body sensations, sounds, like all the stuff from the trauma, and that negative belief about yourself that we were just talking about, like I'm shameful or it's my fault or whatever that is. And then what do we do with a landmine full of this stuff? We don't want to feel that, right? So we do everything we can to avoid
it,
and numb it, block it out, distract ourselves, right? But what she found is that there are some ways to be able to just notice the different sensory pieces while doing bilateral stimulation. So it can be eye movements, it can be tapping, it can be auditory tones that alternate off the midline of the body. And the weird thing is that your brain kind of like goes to that particular index event and kind of goes, oh yeah, I forgot to digest that one. And it just, you can feel things getting put where they go, and you can feel the distress dropping. And there's very often a perspective shift where all of a sudden you may have noticed helpers during the trauma that you didn't think about, or things that you did that were an incredible sense of agency or courage that you couldn't really feel before. And what happens is this gut feeling from before shifts to something better. And people really start to, like, what they know here and what they feel here starts to line up.
Wow.
And this can happen very, very rapidly with this.
So you don't need like 3 years of, tapping or eye movement therapy?
We can get the equivalent of multiple years of talk therapy in a very short time with EMDR therapy. And there are even EMDR intensives when people really want to move through this quickly. I've had people fly in from New York and other places and like stay at a hotel and do, 4 hours a day for a week and get a gigantic amount of their trauma stuff cleared, and feeling different. And sometimes they're actually in treatment with a therapist already that they love, and they don't want to not be in treatment with that therapist. But this piece, like I know why I do these things, or I know why I feel the way I do, like all that intellectual stuff, but this hasn't shifted in their gut. And they come and do this. And I've had, that person's therapist say to me, this is like a different person coming back. Like this, they can talk about things they couldn't even speak about before, and they can talk about them without getting activated, which is, it's life-changing. It's incredibly exciting. But I'm also, as I'm telling you this, as an attorney who litigates these cases, I'm actually thinking about putting a workshop together for attorneys about this.
Are you listening, all you attorneys? Because a lot of my listeners are, my friends and people in law enforcement or police officers or people at true crime,
this can help
lovers.
Your client be able to tolerate assisting you with their case instead of avoiding your calls. First of all, that we can do a piece of this to get the distress down enough that they can tolerate, doing the things that they need to do. Because we all know that these plaintiffs are the last thing on earth they want to do is talk about and deal. It's actually a PTSD symptom, effortful avoidance of reminders of the trauma. So you call trying to help them with what they're doing, and their heart starts racing, and they start getting flooded with intrusive thoughts. So this work is incredibly helpful, but there's a caveat also. If someone does all of their EMDR treatment before trial, and trial can take years, right?
Yes.
You could get someone with a fully reprocessed trauma who can get on the stand and talk incredibly matter-of-factly about this horrific thing that happened to them. And guess what?
It looks like it didn't really affect them.
Exactly.
So that reminds me of a point you were just making earlier about how like criminal, it's traumatic for the victims to testify, but it's a whole different beast when you're talking about civil because, and I had one of the partners at our firm, who's a brilliant attorney, Brian Williams, come on, and he was talking about it. Like when I would put on a witness as a prosecutor, I was proving the crime happened.
Right.
But in civil cases, the litigation is over. Not necessarily did it happen, because a lot of times the perpetrators have already been convicted. True. It's, the negligence on the part of the school or the organization, as well as, well, what are the damages?
Right.
Which you never even get to really talk about in criminal. You just talk about the day it happened and what happened,
right,
as opposed to how did it affect you after this going forward. So you're really, when you're in the civil case, you're living in the trauma, the aftermath, exactly of what you're talking about, this trauma. So yeah, I could see how it'd be like, well, don't get too much, trauma therapy, because people tend to believe people more as witnesses if they're emotional about it.
That's really true. And juries tend to believe that really happened if they can see that this
affected them.
It happened. And this is a really interesting kind of moral quandary to really chew on and think about, because on the one hand, if someone is not sleeping at night and they are in, constant flashbacks and suffering, and they're going to be like that for years, and their brain and their nervous system is now acclimating and adjusting to living like that where they never feel safe, that's fabulous if they can get on the stand for the case itself to show what this did to them. But it's not necessarily in their best interest as a human, because you can't just flip the switch necessarily, even though it could be like, okay, you won your case and now you can really reprocess your trauma. Ideally, you've also reinforced all of those pathological adaptations to living, with that trauma kind of right in your face like that. So sometimes we like to do a certain amount of it so that it's tolerable, but we also, and this is where I'm thinking about getting, I like to work with attorneys also and help educate what changes can happen when people do get good trauma therapy, particularly things like EMDR therapy, what the research of that shows about those changes, so that at best, even if they do some, they can educate the jury about these things as well, and be able to, if they need to, educate the jury, and so that they can understand. And we need to also get good baseline measures about how somebody was functioning right after, before they got this treatment. And now, like, we understand this with like car accidents. Somebody may not have been able to walk, and they might not have been able to move, but then they had surgeries or other kinds of things, and they may be in the process of healing. Doesn't mean that didn't really harm them.
Right, that they weren't injured. Yeah, I have a friend who, and my trainer, who was actually, she was on the show, her name's Tracy, and she was in a terrible car accident, and she was a fitness model, and, her whole life was training people, and she does executive protection, and so it was, everything was about
her identity.
It hit her identity to the core, and then she was a fighter and fought her way back. Like her legs, she showed me pictures, her legs were gigantic from the swelling and the injury. And then by the time the case got around to litigation, she was, back on her A game, but still
they used it against her.
They used it. Well, you're look at you. You train people. You're in great shape. You look amazing. I'm like, wear a fat suit to the, wear a big fat suit to the deposition. No, but it was true.
But she paid a huge price for that.
And you can see it in her gait, in her walk. She doesn't walk the same. So that's exactly why you need an expert witness like you to come in and educate the jury and educate the, even the judge,
Yeah, people don't know how would
or the
they know?
arbitrator or the
And
mediator.
the culture of the courtroom is that if there's a plaintiff, they're lying and exaggerating and trying to get all they can. Well, there may be some people who are doing that, but to presume that someone who this happened to isn't hurting is, also a very difficult and complex thing. And as you're pointing out, the progress that people do make that's very hard won also often gets used against them as evidence that they weren't really harmed. And so that's a complex thing for the people who are trying to get their life back to hold, because they may have months of being flat on their back, miserable, and they get themselves together for a special event or something, and they go to a party or they do something and they pose for a picture, or they do a dance, and they do something, and then that's what gets presented as if that was their life every day.
Yeah, they didn't show the 6 months where they were flat on their back and in terrible agony or pain.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's all it's disheartening especially when you're talking about, someone who's suffered some trauma at the hands of someone else.
Exactly.
In the case of sexual assault, because you're re-traumatizing them, like in terms of like going through the process. Mm-hmm. So that's one of the things I love coming alongside survivors, because I know that they're worried, like I have to bring all this up again. Right. And that's hard.
Yes.
And then not just to talk to your attorney, but then to be cross-examined. And like you said, they always say, oh, you're lying, or, they're accusing you of somehow lying, whether it be about it happening or how you suffered from that. Mm-hmm. And that's one of a lot of the reasons that victims of sexual abuse don't want to come forward or litigate the case, because then you're just, the one thing they were worried about was not being believed. And now the attorney on the opposing side who's accusing them of lying, it's re-triggering them or traumatizing them. So what can, like I do as an attorney, to help come alongside those survivors to help them not be re-traumatized by the process itself? Is this...
Connect them with therapy resources, first of all, in terms of support that way. And that can be tricky too, in terms of it's discoverable and it's, all of that for the case. So they don't really have total privacy either in talking. Like if I talk to my therapist about this, it's also, the people who are cross-examining me are also going to be reading.
Yeah, they get the therapy records, right?
Of course they do. And they should. They have a right to, of course. But it, to put yourself in the shoes of the survivor, all of the paths of what one does to be able to come through something like that are really complicated, and to not be believed and to have these kinds of difficulties. People almost never just make this stuff up for attention or something else. And the teeny minuscule percentage that do, and they're rare, tend to be people, if you look at their history, overwhelmingly, they're people who've lied about all kinds of other things their entire lives and have a history of lots of mental health problems before this. But when we look statistically at the number of sexual assaults, for example, that are prosecuted and there's any kind of meaningful sentencing, as well as I do, there's just a tiny number.
It's not common at all. In my experience, for people to be making those things up. There's situations where it does happen. It can happen. Obviously, we can't say that it never happens, because it does. But for the most part, especially when you're talking about like children, no child is going to just make up, some of the horrible tales that I've heard.
They don't have the vocabulary.
They don't have it. And you can see the trauma and the fear and the pain alongside, their testimony.
And this ends up really impacting these kids for the rest of their lives and their functioning as adults. And there's something about child sexual abuse that is so different from the other types of abuse that if people are listening and they think about abuse, like if you see somebody walking down the street with a baseball bat and they want to hit you with it, it's very easy to recognize that is something I want no part of. And, you know, theoretically, if you could get away, you would get away. And if you ever saw anyone with a baseball bat again, you would avoid them, right? The problem with sexual abuse and the grooming and the body parts that are involved with the abuse itself and the way that the nervous system is wired is that a lot of the stimulation and things that happen are supposed to be associated with good feelings. And people also kind of want to be able to, as adults, have a healthy sexual life with another person in a way that's not traumatic. So it's almost like, you know, like an alcoholic can decide that they're going to be completely sober and not take a drink. Someone with an eating disorder has to change their relationship with food because they can't stop eating, right?
Right.
And so if people want to heal from sexual abuse and their brain has paired all of these sensations and feelings, even pleasure sometimes, which is a complex thing to talk about because it doesn't mean they consented. It doesn't mean that this wasn't damaging. But if your brain is all messed up with those things being associated also with shame and trauma and feeling horrible about yourself, the healing process is a lot more complicated, right? Because you can't, I mean, some people could just say, okay, I'm just never going to have any sexual contact with anybody or myself. But that's not fully healing either. So being able to support and normalize that for people and help them understand that that's part of what makes that such a terrible crime against you, that your brain got these confusing, messed up, you know, dangerous, toxic messages about something that was supposed to mean something else. That's part of the understanding the damage and the harm as well.
And the EMDR helps with that.
Unbelievably. It's so powerful.
And what other techniques? Can you tell us about some other techniques?
There's EMDR therapy is the one that I love the most. There is a guy named Peter Levine who does something called somatic experiencing, which is a body of somatic type of work as well.
What does somatic mean? I sound like a dummy.
Somatic means in the body.
Okay.
Yeah. There are multiple things. There's brain spotting. There are it's interesting because a lot of the older ways of treating trauma focused a lot on cognitive therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy. There's even like a trauma-informed cognitive
What is
therapy.
Cognitive behavioral therapy? Is that like something you tell them to do?
Well, the problem very often when you're using it with trauma, and this is a controversy in the field.
Okay. So not every therapist.
There are people who will sit here and say that the gold standard of trauma treatment is cognitive behavioral therapy or trauma-informed cognitive behavioral therapy. The problem is that focuses on your belief system and your cognitions and how those influence your behavior. And it's very scripted, and there's a lot of homework, and people have to kind of go over and over and over the traumatic event and talk about it over and over again. And there's homework in between the sessions and a lot of things that people don't like to do. I'm also actually, as I'm talking about this, there's some of this is also common to something called exposure therapy, where exposure therapy was an older way of doing this too, where the idea was that you just kind of bombard people with the traumatic thing until they kind of stopped responding in a traumatized way. And I can tell by your face that you're like, oh, that sounds really terrible.
Yeah, that
right?
sounds terrible, just to go over and over and over again.
People hated it. And a lot of the time, they use this in the military, I think, a lot with people. They shoot at you enough, you learn to ignore the bullets kind of thing. But the thing is that even when people did sometimes get a deadened trauma response, two things. One, they kind of drop to not quite meeting criteria for the diagnosis anymore, but still feeling pretty crappy on the one hand.
That doesn't sound like it heals your body and the connection of your nervous system to
Not
the
at all.
brain and the memories and where it's trapped.
No, and you're not feeling alive and whole and safe and good enough or anything. You're just, as a matter of fact, when it deadens that, very often it can deaden also things like joy and spontaneity and play, where people just kind of are more shut down, which I don't know about you, but I don't think that's the best outcome.
Not at all. That's a terrible way to live. That's the thing. I want
Yeah.
people to hear like this message of hope about like healing the trauma.
Healing trauma's really treatable, and sometimes people when they do the cognitive approaches think that they're somehow doing something wrong or they're not good at therapy, because when you go with the cognitions first, what we know about the nervous system is that when you go into fight, flight, freeze, when your nervous system has a trauma response, this part that you use for your cognitions shuts down. It goes offline. So the part of your body that you're trying to use when you activate the trauma and you really go there in your body is very often not available to you. It's there for a shortcut. Like it's there so that you can be in survival mode and react instead of respond, and not overthink things so that you can get through the immediate danger. Yeah. But we're not meant to live in that state.
So do people who suffer from some trauma, whether it be sexual or otherwise, do they do their brains and their body get stuck in, or one or the other gets stuck in that fight or flight mode?
Exactly. When you experience trauma, many people's nervous system gets stuck in fight or flight. It can also get stuck in freeze. There's also another trauma response that is lesser known called fawn. A lot of women do this. You may see this in your cases where it's basically, and these are automatic responses. People don't consciously choose them. Your body kind of goes, oh boy, this is how we're going to survive. Can I run? Can I fight? No. Well, if I play dead, is that going to work? The fawn response is, I have to make this person who's the perpetrator be nice to me, or see me as human, or make him think that like I like him, or do all of these kinds of responses that you see sometimes in survivors to get through the assault itself, are things their nervous system decided for them. This is how you're going to live. And very often later, they second guess themselves and they feel guilty, and why didn't I
do this or this
Yeah.
or this, when really your body was just in survival mode. Let me get out of this immediate danger, and this is my best way to do it in that moment.
Absolutely.
Wow.
And
So
freeze is like that too, where sometimes your body says, don't move, and that's the best response. And you can tell with things like a sexual assault crime, if somebody goes into a freeze mode, their brain is also scanning, like, when is the opportunity for me to be able to activate and get the hell out of here? Like you hear about people staring at a clock or gauging, where are we and what are my chances, and they're focusing on very narrow, specific kinds of things. And it's very interesting when you see in a courtroom when a woman freezes instead of fights back, and it gets argued that, oh, that's consent, she didn't fight back. Well, if she were in a consensual sexual situation, she'd be focusing on very different things than
not the clock.
not the clock, not the how do I get, she'd be focusing on things that she was enjoying feeling. And that's not what people report in these situations.
Wow, that's fascinating. So there's all these therapies that can help people really get their life back.
Yes, 100%.
And I've found, and I'm just curious in terms of like the psychological part of this, but like how trauma gets, then like you were saying, this fight or flight, this freeze state, it actually stores it, the trauma gets stored in your body and can then manifest itself in physical ways.
And that is, there's been some really interesting studies that Stephen Porges started originally, polyvagal theory, that there's this whole web of nerves and that start from your 12th cranial nerve, and they call it the vagus nerve, which is not about gambling, but
Oh, vagus nerve. Got it.
It's vagus.
So it's called
polyvagal theory, that we knew that there was this. Vagus means wandering, and I love the Latin root of things. It's nerdy of me, but
it is a little nerdy, but I love it. It makes you sound so smart. I'm going to learn another language besides
I don't
gibberish.
understand Latin,
Pig Latin.
but I speak Pig Latin. but it's like this is part of the nervous system that does, fight and flight and freeze, but there's also this other part of the nervous system that
forgive my ignorance, which it is 100% ignorance, but where is this vagus nerve?
Most people don't know this, so this is totally, I find this really fascinating. It's your 12th cranial nerve, so it starts, from your brain, and it goes to a bunch of places. The ventral vagal also goes to like your eyes. It goes to your throat. It actually wanders all through your body, but it pretty much goes through the midline of your viscera. And here's where, let's just think about it this way. When something scares the crap out of you, where do you feel it?
Your chest.
You feel it in your chest, right?
Yeah.
Your heart may pound, your stomach may drop. If your husband heard you on the phone, could he hear in your voice that something wasn't right? All of that wiring has to do with this.
Yeah, like my feet aren't hurting when I'm scared, or
right.
my hands,
It's
right?
all along the midline. The fight or flight system is all wired along the midline. What's really interesting about the bilateral stimulation with EMDR that we talked about is that by alternating, stimulating off the midline of the body while you're noticing, it activates the parasympathetic, which is the opposite, which is the we're cool, we're safe, relax, that system. And it sort of like hacks into it and tells your body that you're safe now. And you start to be able to feel that. So this is all, when you put it all together, it makes incredible sense.
That's fascinating. And it sounds like it actually literally rewires the thoughts in your brain, circling in your brain, which obviously corresponds to your body being rewired as well. Physically rewired.
It actually physically rewires your brain, and there have even been some really cool studies where people who have PTSD have a part of their brain called the hippocampus that is smaller, and it has to do with a memory function, but it can actually shrink in people with PTSD. The volume of it gets smaller. And they've done these functional MRI studies where they see the brain while it's working when someone has trauma and has PTSD, and they've gotten the volume of their hippocampus, and then they've done EMDR therapy. This is really wild. Functionally, the brain now looks like a brain without PTSD, and the hippocampus actually has gotten bigger.
That's fascinating.
It's so incredible.
Wow. That is fascinating. I love it. Well, gosh, I want to talk to you more, and we are out of time for this episode. So you're coming back for another episode, yes?
I'd love to.
Okay, I can't wait, because we have so much more to unpack. This polyvagal theory is fascinating and can really help survivors of trauma. Wow. And you do, so while we wrap up, I got to let people know how they can find you, and because it sounds like just such an incredibly valuable resource and tool, for lawyers out there who need an expert, right?
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Arutt is the gal for you. I'm just saying. So where can people find you? And I can't wait to talk to you more, because there's so much more to unpack about you and your story and all the things that you've done. Because I know you've been on TV and all these, been an analyst on news and talked about, really important cases. And so I do want to talk more about that. But for now, where can people find you?
Thank you so much. You can find me at my website is askdrcheryl.com. Cheryl with a C, and also creativeemdr.com. I also have an Instagram, which is Ask Dr. Cheryl, that you can follow me there. I don't post that often, but I do have a presence there with some things. I would love, if people have questions, I'd love them to get in touch.
Wow, that's awesome. And so people can hire you, lawyers can hire you to do forensic evaluations for their clients, patients.
Or consulting, actually. I also with attorneys, if they've done an evaluation and they need consultation about strategy, if they're looking at opposing counsel's evaluation and they need, one of the things I really enjoy doing sometimes is taking those apart.
Ooh, that's another thing we got to talk about.
So, you know. So
you can come alongside an attorney who has a psychological evaluation from the other side and pick apart, if it's pick apartable.
If it's pick apart, and it may be, there have been cases where I've told you, there's been cases where I said, I can't help you here. This is,
Oh, we got to talk about that story. Yeah, where you were like, yeah, thanks. And we'll leave a little teaser for the next episode.
Next time.
Yes, next time. Then when she went into a prison and was asked to do something interesting.
Yes.
And that did not bode well for the client in which you were asked to interview and create an
technically his attorney was my client.
Oh.
But yes.
Yeah,
absolutely. It didn't bode well for him. It actually probably helped the attorney a lot, though, to be like, we'll talk more about that.
Yeah, we'll have to hear about that story. Okay, it's fascinating. Okay, so people can find you one more time. Tell us where they can find you.
AskDrCheryl.com and CreativeEMDR.com.
And your last name, Arutt, is pronounced Arutt, but it's spelled A-R.
It's A-R-U-T-T, and it rhymes with carrot, but it's not spelled like carrot. I know it's...
Okay, but pronounced Dr. Arutt.
Yes.
Cheryl Arutt. Ask Dr. Cheryl. And...
Creative EMDR.
And it's pronounced like carrot.
Yes.
And you have red hair. So just remember, look for the beautiful doctor with the red hair. And you can ask her all the questions that you want. Wow, this has been just completely fascinating to me. And I can't wait to talk to you more in the next episode. So thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
And coming alongside people who have suffered any kind of trauma, and just to give them hope and healing, which really, on a more global level, it's not just helping that one person, it's helping their family to get their, their wives and their mothers and their sisters and their daughters back.
It affects
everybody. It affects us, just globally and humanity. It really is fascinating. Such valuable work. And I just can't thank you enough for being so well versed in it that you're able to actually really help someone. It's amazing. It's amazing what you do, and I'm humbled by all the people that you've been able to help. And
you're helping a lot of people too.
Yeah.
So thank you for everything that you're doing as well.
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you. I do appreciate that. And so, wow, that's a wrap for this one. But you got to tune in, because she's coming back on our next episode, and I can't wait to hear more and find out about that juicy case you were telling us about. And so until we meet again, if you can't find the light, be the light, like Dr. Cheryl Arutt. So long now.
Be the light, shine so bright.